talk, and I think the first batch of people have joined us. So we will get started with the introduction. So thank you very much for joining us today at the University of Connecticut Brain Imaging Research Center, or BIRC Speaker Tag Series. I am the host, Fumiko Haft, Director of the Brain Imaging Research Center and Professor of Psychological Sciences, Mathematics, Neuroscience, and Psychiatry. So this speaker series is unique in that the speaker tags the next speaker. Also, I call this the Ponzi scheme. If you've been to this lecture before, I know you've heard me make this joke before, so I apologize that it's saying this many times. But I call this a Ponzi scheme because essentially once you get a great speaker and you say that that person spoke to, you keep on getting great speakers like we do today. And so today we have Daphna Shohamy and as today's speaker. So since April, we've had Daniel Ansari, Lucina Udin, Nathan Sprung, Danny Bassett, and now Daphna. We've had about 100 and 200 people join each session from over 100 institutions participating from all over the world. As you see in this slide, you can view previous recordings from wonderful speakers such as Tor Wager, Kim Noble, and so on, which is on our website. And you can also sign up to get updates on our talk series by emailing Lizzie that you see here, elizabeth.cullen@uconn.edu. So some housekeeping items, I have it in the chat box as well, but you'll be muted. And I will try, and I always try, and I never seem to get it right, but I'll try to unmute everyone at the beginning and also at the end so we have the opportunity to clap. I know you can do the emoji sort of clap thing, but I think it's always nice to actually hear at least several people clapping. If you have questions, please enter it in the chat box, and we will take most of them at the end, but if we can, we'll take them at the interim summary sections. And let's see, I will be moderating and we'll be checking the chat box as we go, so if there's any urgent messages, please let us know as well. So we'll get started. So today it is our great pleasure to introduce Professor Daphna Shohamy. Daphna is a neuroscientist and professor of psychology at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute and a member of the Kavli Center for Brain Sciences. Her research uses behavioral research, brain imaging, and studies with patients to explore the neural processes by which memory, learning, and decision-making interact. She's trained at a number of institutions, including her undergraduate work at Tel Aviv University in Psychology and Humanities, her PhD work with Mark Gluck at Rutgers University, where she investigated the role of basal ganglia in learning and memory in Parkinson's disease. She did her postdoctoral fellowship with Anthony Wagner at Stanford University, where I was also a postdoc as well, and that's how we met. So it was great. Nice surprise to see Danny Bassett nominate Daphna this time. She gave a great talk. I still remember her talk from her postdoc days at Stanford. She has received funding from Templeton, Claremont, Dana, McKnight, Michael J. Fox Foundations, as well as NIDA and MH, as well as NSF. And she's a recipient of the prestigious McKnight Foundation Award, the Association for Psychological Sciences, Janet Spence Award, and the Young Investigator Award from the Cognitive Neuroscience Society and the Society for Neuroeconomics. Please join me in welcoming her. I'm going to unmute all of you so you have the opportunity to clap. Now you're all unmuted. No babies crying in the background today, so that's great. I will mute all of you again. Okay, so I think, wait, let me see. Lizzie, can you try unmuting everyone?
Yes, I think it should be all set now. You are also muted.
Yep. Daphna, can you, let me see if I'll unmute you. I think you're unmuted now.
Okay. Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Oh, you all disappeared on me. I was so hoping that wouldn't happen. I had it all set up so that I could see faces and names while I gave my talk, and now it looks like that won't work. So let me try one more time to just reshare my screen, if that's okay, and see, make sure I'm still on the Zoom call.
Yes, you're on Zoom.
Okay, and you can see, let me share my screen and see if that works. I redo it. Just give it one. It seems worth the effort.
It's working.
All right.
It looks good.
You can see the screen? Okay, now I can see you. Thank you for inviting me. It was really, thank you to Danny for suggesting me. It's a really fun suggestion to kind of create this network, especially when it gives us a chance to kind of promote our favorite colleagues' work inadvertently, and also helps, it sounds like it also helps you with the recruiting via this kind of Ponzi scheme. So it's win-win. And, you know, of course, it's always strange for those of you in the audience who have had the dubious pleasure of doing this. It's always strange speaking by yourself in a room to kind of a bunch of black boxes. So I will do my best. Fumika and I were talking about the fact that, you know, if there are any urgent questions, feel free to ask them. If there's anything that requires clarification, send those questions in. And for me in particular, I'm really kind of by nature an eye contact kind of person, so I'll do my best to kind of suppress the need for that. I think the sort of, you know, the eye contact and communication and sharing our science is important even in normal days, but I feel like actually the need for that is greater now than ever. And I think it's fantastic that you've taken your talk series onto an online platform with all its many advantages in these very, very strange times. And for me, I just felt like I couldn't just get up here and talk about work and science without saying just a few words about how completely insane and challenging the world is for so many of us right now in so many different ways. And so I actually just wanted to acknowledge both some signs for hope. I thought this decision by the Supreme Court was really uplifting for those of us, you know, who are so invested in equality and diversity. And it's been, in many ways, really heartening to see the protests recently. But I also know this is a time of pain and reckoning. And for many of us, I think in academia, also a time for us to really do some soul searching about diversity and equality in our walls of academia, in our society. And I know for myself and for people in my lab, it's really been a moment to stop and think about what our role is and what can we do to make things better as scientists. And I think especially as people who study the mind, I think so much of what's happening in society right now sort of speaks to limitations in our ability to socialize, connect, and in many ways in our ability to make decisions. So the work in my lab focuses specifically on decision making, not with that angle so far of societal decision making, but really thinking more about individual decision making and how it happens. And, you know, the kind of examples you think of are when we think of decisions, often people think of sort of monetary decisions, but I think, you know, really decisions are sort of pervasive in everything we do. They reflect who we are and they shape who we become, whether it's whether to give a talk over Zoom or not, where to give that talk, what to talk about, how much new data to include, what coffee to order in the morning, and so who to marry. And so there are all these kind of aspects of decision making that really are kind of fundamental to our identity and our behavior in the world. And I know for many of us across many disciplines, really one of the fundamental questions is how do we learn from experience to make good decisions as opposed to bad ones? Again, a sort of question that's sort of particularly sharpened for several of us at this moment in time. And this is a question that is actually received a pretty solid answer from systems and cognitive neuroscience in the last 10 to 20 years. And that's been, in many ways, a story of great advances. And the short answer that we see in sort of a wide array of papers being published over the last 10, 15 years, many of them, several of them I cited here, but there's many, many more. And the answer is that we know that the striatum plays a really fundamental role in learning from experience to make decisions. That part of the way that happens is that the striatum learns from the outcomes of decisions we made in the past, and what it learns is an average value for candidate cues or options, and the idea being that we sort of learn from experience what's likely to lead to a good outcome, what's likely not to lead to a good outcome. That this learning takes place incrementally. We go through an experience many times for that learning to kind of be solidified, And most of us really think this is kind of a neural circuit that supports habitual learning, our ability to learn through many experiences to kind of automatically, habitually choose the good things and avoid the bad things. And one of the problems that I find really fascinating in this regard is that in spite of all this progress on this one particular narrow slice of decision making, is that most decisions really don't work that way. And many of the most fundamental decisions we make in our lives, but also many trivial ones, we can't really rely on an average value that's incrementally learned or on a habit. So just to give you an example of the decision you all face, should you attend the BIRC talk this month? Some of you might have not attended a talk through this mechanism before. Some of you might have done it, several times over the summer or before then. And so some of you might have only been to Danny Bassett's talk last week, in which case it's a really tough, or last time, which was a really tough act to follow for me. But you might have this one singular experience that dictated your decision this time. Moreover, I think those of you who have been to every talk and are debating it each time anew, I'd say that, more, or in addition to learning kind of the average value of that particular candidate action, you also have specific memories. You remember who spoke and which talks were better and which talks were not as good, or how you were feeling that day. So we have these really rich sources of traces of our own experiences over time, even for something that we've done over and over again. And it's clear that all of those rich traces of information are playing into our decisions all the time. And so there's sort of this fundamental role in our subjective experience for memory, for the richness of memory in guiding our decisions. But actually, as kind of neurobiologists, the mechanisms by which this form of rich memory plays into our decision making has been relatively less well understood. And that's really the question that's been driving the research in my lab, is to try to understand how these other forms of memory guide decision making, what the mechanisms are, and how do these different forms of decision making and drawing on memory really kind of complement each other and work together. So the working framework that I'm going to try to present evidence for today, and that's been guiding our work for a while, is that in addition to the role of the striatum in this kind of incremental learning, we also must have a system that allows us to kind of probe a specific sample of an experience. I'm sitting here looking at, Fumiko, and I'm remembering those days as a postdoc at Stanford, something that happened, 15 years ago, and yet I can bring that up vividly, richly, and it will affect the way I'm thinking in the moment. So we have to have a mechanism that can sample that kind of information for a decision, a mechanism that can use information about a particular episode, something that happened only once. And we need a mechanism for being able to use these forms of memory flexibly, because of course the decisions we face right now are different from the decisions we faced a week ago or 2 weeks ago or 12 years ago. And we have a good candidate structure in the brain that we know is really specialized for supporting all these kinds of functions of memory. And that is the hippocampus. And so the main thrust of our work in the lab over the last 10 years or so has been to try to understand, take kind of everything we know about the role of the hippocampus in memory, and use that to address open questions about how we use memory to guide the decisions we make and what the implications are, both for the decisions we make, but also kind of how we get there. And we actually just had a paper come out maybe a week or so ago in TICS. This is by my graduate student, Natalie Biederman, who just had a baby yesterday, and my former postdoc, Akram Bapour, who's starting a lab next month at University of Chicago, and really tried to summarize the wealth of the evidence for the role of the hippocampus in decision-making and the ways in which it challenges both our understanding of decision-making, but also how it challenges, I think, the way we really think about what the hippocampus does. So I'm going to share with you today some of the work covered in that reviewed article and that we've been focusing our efforts on in the last several years. And the general kind of, one slide cartoon of this is the idea that the hippocampus encodes these very rich memories of episodes and specific events, and that information then feeds into a role of the striatum in calculating expected value and working with other prefrontal cortical regions, so that these areas are actually really working together to use the hippocampus as essentially a source of memory and input and evidence to weigh in the decision-making process and trying to understand how that happens. So just for those of you, I saw some familiar names who won't need this slide, but others presumably will, and maybe their names are less familiar to me. But just a reminder of sort of what are we talking about when we talk about the hippocampus, because I think like many brain structures, there's sort of these sub-communities in our field to really think about the cartoon characterization of the one role of a brain region in different ways. Right, so here's the hippocampus in our medial temporal lobe, and for many of us in the field of memory, it's very well known for its role in building these one-shot episodes, what I had for breakfast yesterday, where I saw Fumiko at the Stanford campus 12 years ago. But of course, there's a separate huge literature about the role of the hippocampus and surrounding medial temporal cortices in navigation, right? It sort of dovetails with the ideas of memory, but really have been developed somewhat independently. And recently, there's been a lot of work on the role of the hippocampus in prospection. So the ability to use, we rely on the hippocampus for our ability to think about the future, separate potentially from any ability to retrieve an event from the past. So if I ask you to think about the next speaker, and well, that will be, like we know from brain imaging studies and patient studies, that is also a function that engages and depends on the hippocampus. And I think really one of the most compelling theories that ties together these seemingly disparate functions has been proposed by Neil Cohen and Howard Eichenbaum. It's the idea of relational memory, the idea that the hippocampus binds elements of an experience across time and space. And it's this fundamental sort of binding mechanism across time and space that positions the hippocampus and its function to be important, both for building memories that involve binding of information, as well as navigating space and navigating time, and as well as sort of time travel, not just backwards, but forward by sort of recombining elements of an experience in this kind of relational mechanism. And for us, this particular angle on thinking about hippocampal function has been very important because it suggests new ways of thinking about how the hippocampus might contribute to decision-making above and beyond the ability to sort of just pull back a memory from the past, and suggests that it's really playing a fundamental role in a kind of diverse aspects of decision-making. And so just kind of a bird's eye view on this, you know, in many ways we sort of started with a question of research on decision-making, kind of a gap in our understanding, and turned to the research on memory mechanisms to kind of leverage it to gain insight into how decisions are made. And along the way, I think we've really sort of uncovered, you know, the reverse pattern as well, where in the end, research on decision-making and highlighting, investigating the role of the hippocampus in decision-making has come back to change the way we think about the organization of memory mechanisms in the brain. And in particular, I think it's really come back to challenge this idea of distinct memory systems as being the fundamental organizing principle for memory systems in the brain. This is an idea that goes back to our textbooks and work from decades ago, and really back to HM, this idea that we have declarative memory that's separate from non-declarative memory. And the work on decision-making has really highlighted the very many and important ways in which the striatum and the hippocampus and sort of unconscious and conscious forms of memory are working together to shape decisions in a moment. So the general approach that we've adopted to try to tackle these questions at the intersection of decision-making and memory have been mostly, I like to say, the most cutting edge thing we do is really that we're developing new behavioral paradigms. I think as people who study the mind can't miss an opportunity to emphasize how difficult that is to capture behavior in a way that's specific and insightful, and how the way we build our tasks really kind of constrains everything else we do, regardless of what we're measuring with the fancy tools we now have. And so for us, the kind of guiding principle has been to try to stick to very simple decision behaviors that don't require memory, don't ask people to memorize anything, and just ask in very simple decision tasks, can we identify with behavior and with brain kind of the leaking in of memory traces into the decisions people make? And I'll show some examples as we go through. The second tool we've been using, of course, is functional MRI, try to look at the interactive dynamic mechanisms of neural circuits in learning and memory. And this is really where Danny Bassett and I intersected several years ago. I was visiting UPenn, and she and I just had this great meeting and this moment of recognizing that her tools were really sorely missing from the learning and memory literature, because the tools Danny has developed really allow us to look at whole brain connectivity and how it adapts over learning. And for many aspects of learning, that's going to be fundamental. So that kind of taking, I think, our field into a new era of stopping the focus on particular modules for learning and sort of really looking at more whole brain networks and the orchestration of and the configuration of their activity. And finally, this makes me kind of old school, but I really feel strongly we've always sort of complemented the imaging and behavioral studies with studies of patients with brain damage, in particular looking for, is there robust evidence from patients with damage to either the striatum or the hippocampus in terms of the manifestation in simple decision-making tasks. And I'll show you some relatively new data from amnesics towards the end of the talk today on a very simple decision-making task where we see some impairments. So the kind of three things I'm going to touch upon today are first to talk about this role for episodes, how this sort of idea of one-shot learning and how it plays into decisions. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about this notion of flexibility and what we mean when we talk about flexibility and why I think it's an important way to think about the role of memory in decision-making. And finally, I'm going to talk about a relatively recent study about essentially deliberation and how mechanisms of memory might be playing an important role in allowing us to weigh the options when we're deliberating and facing choices that are not easy. So the fundamental question guiding this kind of research direction has been to try to understand how decisions are guided by one-shot episodes. This idea that something happened once and now you want to sort of, you end up using that information to make a decision. And the challenge here is that even though we all kind of anecdotally know that that happens, something happened once, we think if we ate at a restaurant once and we sort of can, be fully aware that we're using that memory to decide what to order at that same restaurant again. But from an experimental perspective, it's actually been really challenging to experimentally track which memory is being used for a given decision, right? So when we have somebody make choices over and over again, we really don't know what mental representation they're accessing, and that's kind of been the challenge in this direction. And many of us really think of that as like a human problem. I just want to emphasize, for any of the people in the audience, but really for all of us, that this is not just a problem when we think about the rich human cognition and deliberation. This is really a problem with rodent studies too. We assume that if we're conditioning a rodent to press the right lever to receive sugar water, that's because they've learned over and over again that the right lever is better. But really, we don't know at any given moment for any one decision what that rat is mentally representing in guiding that decision. Maybe they're remembering that the right lever was the good choice 7 trials back, right? We just don't have the ability to differentiate between those options in the tasks we've been using. So our approach to this in a series of studies have been to design tasks that start with this kind of typical average learning task that involves repeated choices and fluctuating average value, and then to add trial unique episodes, as I'll show you in a moment, that allow us to kind of experimentally track what people are doing. And so I'm going to walk you through one example of this kind of study. This was done in collaboration with Catherine Duncan, a former postdoc who's now at University of Toronto, Raphael Garrity, a former grad student who's now postdoc with Nico Pricascorte, and my longtime collaborator, Nathaniel Daw, who's at Princeton. And what we did is we started with this task, which has been in the kind of value-based decision-making literature, really kind of the workhorse of reinforcement learning. And for those of you less familiar with that field, I'll just briefly walk you through it. In these tasks, usually you look at the screen, you see 2 options, in this case, a red square and a blue square, and you have to choose one. And first you're just guessing, you don't really know. In this case, let's say you chose the red one and you won 75 cents. In the task here, you could win between 0 cents and $1. 75 cents is above average, so that was a good outcome. The critical thing in these sorts of tasks is that you're then asked to choose between the same 2 options over and over again, and the outcome varies over time. So it might be 65 cents the next time. Can you see my cursor? Okay, great. And so the idea here is that in this example, you can see on the x-axis here is just sort of a schematic or trials, and the magnitude of reward, it could be the probability of reward on the y-axis. And the critical feature here to pay attention to is that the likelihood of reward or reward magnitude changes over time gradually. So here's a phase of the task where red is the better choice. Here's a phase of the task where blue is the better choice. And even when red is the better choice, it fluctuates too. And so the kind of trick in these sorts of tasks has been to use very, very noisy outcomes given a choice, and then to be asked to what extent are people tracking the kind of pattern of rewards in their choices, and do people update their choices? Do they learn from the outcomes to update their choices on the next trial? And so I just want to point out in this particular version, there's these reversals that co-occur, and we're going to really take advantage of those reversals in what I'm going to show you next. Behavior on these tasks has been shown across hundreds of studies is very well fit by reinforcement learning models. And this has been an important demonstration, of the fact that these tasks are thought to involve the sort of incremental learning of value, which is the main thing that's assumed to happen, that's implemented in some of the simplest reinforcement learning models. And this is also fundamental to the history of the connection between the striatum as dopaminergic inputs and this form of trial by trial learning, the idea that dopaminergic signaling kind of tracks with this magnitude that's important for learning, and we'll come back to that in more detail. So what we did here is we basically took this kind of design and made one particular modification to it, which is that now, in addition to choosing red and blue, which you still are, and it's the red and blue choices are still following this exact same scheme. You could follow the red and blue cards to know what the outcome is. We also added these objects onto these red and blue squares, or cards as we're calling them here. So in this case, the red card also has a Rubik's Cube. The blue card in this trial has a yellow taxi. But there are sort of two critical things to note here. First, that the objects have no bearing on the reward structure, okay? And second, that objects appear either once or at most twice. So there's no kind of gradual incremental learning about the value of the objects. If you chose the Rubik's Cube here, and this and the red, and this was 75 cents, if the Rubik's Cube appears again, the Rubik's Cube, whether it's on a blue card or a red card on the next time, will still be worth 75 cents. So we basically set this up that there are kind of two sources of information here. There's the color of the card, the red or the blue, and there are these individual objects, the Rubik's Cube or the taxi. And so here's an example of showing how at a different phase of the task later on, you might see the Rubik's Cube on a red card again, side by side with an object you've never seen before. And so what we can do is we can basically take an object that appeared when red was the better card, and we can then display occasionally an object like that for the second time at a phase now when blue is the better deck, right? So we can basically pit these two sources of memory against each other and see what people choose. So we have, in this case, for this trial, we have the object that's worth 75 cents, but we have the blue deck that's on average worth 70 cents and the red deck that's worth on average 30 cents. And we can ask in this situation, to what extent are people likely to go with the better winning deck versus the high value object? So just for the sake of terminology, we're looking at a deck which has information on every trial. That's the red and the blue. We're really treating that as sort of on the assumption that people are learning about the average. And an object that is appearing maximally twice. And we can see in that sense to what extent people are using episodic information. And importantly, they're really not correlated in this task. So there's no correlation, positive or negative, between these sources of knowledge. And that means that now we can measure whether one-shot episodes influence what people choose. So the first question we ask is, in this kind of task where people don't have to track the value of the episode at all, are decisions influenced by episodes? So what I'm going to show you here is just behavioral data in the simplest possible form, looking at trials since reversal on the x-axis as a function of the likelihood of choosing the lucky deck for a given moment in time on the y-axis. And what you can see is, on average, people improve the chances or are more likely to choose the lucky deck as they move away from the reversal, right? Suggesting that they're figuring out which deck is worth more as they learn. Again, sort of the simplest possible way we could plot it, we want to look at, are they using value of the episodes? And so on the x-axis, we have the old object value going from 0 cents to $1. And on the y-axis, the likelihood of choosing the old object, again, just sort of ignoring now whether it was on a red deck or a blue deck, just in general, across trials, are people using the value of the single object? And we find that the answer is yes. So again, we have sort of robust behavioral evidence that people are more likely to choose an object if they see it again when it was a high value object than when it was a low value object. So this suggests that decisions are guided by averages as well as episodes. And this really allows us to ask kind of the next question, which is, if participants really don't have to use the episodes, but they do, then what are the neural mechanisms? What happens sort of on those trials when people are accessing that information? And so in many ways, when we sort of shift to talk about this question, really, how are decisions guided by averages or episodes? Now that we have behavioral evidence across several studies that people really do use both of them and kind of arbitrate between them to some extent. So I want to give you just a flavor of kind of what that analysis looks like. What I'm plotting on the top here are the actual choices people make. So it's a binary choice. People are choosing blue or red or left or right, however you want to look at it, but they're making a binary choice over trials. And so the data we have in terms of the actual choices is simply, did they choose blue or red on a given trial? But we also have information about each participant's history of choices and their history of outcomes for each choice they made. And so we can take advantage of that to start to make inferences about how people are deciding. And so what we do is we use that information to estimate the likelihood that a choice is episodic. So for example, here's a sort of an example of what that estimated likelihood is. I'm just gonna sort of give you an intuition. If you look at this trial here, you have a trial where there was a stream of choices of red, suggesting that the participant is on a phase where red is winning and they know that, and yet they made a choice here for the blue. So you want to ask why that is, and so then we can go back and ask, when they did that, was this old object that they chose a high value object or a low value object? And we can put all that information into a simple calculation, and from there estimate the likelihood that a choice was episodic. In this case, it's calculating that it's very high likelihood that that choice was episodic given all those factors. And we're going to use this approach in the fMRI analysis by using these subject-specific and trial-specific estimates of episodic choice and asking where in the brain are there voxels that correlate with the likelihood that the choice is episodic. And so what I'm showing you here is the result of that fMRI analysis of looking at episodic choice. And as you can see, we see several regions in the brain, as those of us who do fMRI know is often the case. Right, so we see this sort of interesting back of the brain visual activity related to an episodic choice, perhaps because they're choosing based on an object. But we also see this significant bold activity correlating with this measure all along the axis of the hippocampus. So this suggests that choices that are guided by a single past event are associated with bold activity in the hippocampus. What we really want to know is, how did people learn the value of that object to begin with, and can we identify the brain mechanisms that supported that? So what we can do now is we can take the same quantity of sort of the likelihood that choice was episodic, and instead of looking at it at the time when people made that choice, we can ask, what did brain activity look like last time they encountered that object? And so when we do this sort of back-sorted analysis to figure out when they learned the value of the object, what we see here is sort of activity in a lot of the usual suspects of value or reward learning, in particular these sort of bilateral regions of the putamen that are very typically activated in response to rewarding outcomes. So it suggests that encoding of episodic value is associated with bold activity in the striatum, and episodic choice is associated with bold activity in the hippocampus. So just as a quick interim summary, it suggests that memory for single episodes guides decisions in a dynamic reward learning task, that the hippocampus and the striatum work together to support learning and reward-based decisions. And this, I think, really raises a fundamental question, should be on your mind, is, well, is the hippocampus necessary for this? And you know, I think that's really going back to HM and some of the early work by Dan Schechter and Larry Squire and many others. You sort of really want to ask that difficult question, sort of lesion data, and what would happen if one could not access those episodic memories, and that's something we're currently working on. I'm not going to have time to show you this, but for those of you who are interested in development in particular, there's work by my former graduate student, Julia Davidow, who's shown that hippocampal contributions to this kind of trial by error learning are even greater in adolescence than during adulthood. And former graduate student Kendall Brown, who showed that what I showed you is sort of an effect on choice, that there's sort of a complementary effect also on memory, where reward retroactively enhances memory and kind of priming or strengthening the likelihood that rewarded objects would be remembered for later memory. And I'm wondering, in my speaking to black screen kind of experience, if there are any questions coming in that seem worth, before I kind of pivot to the next section, that anybody wants to ask?
I think we can keep on moving for now. Thank you, though.
Okay, I'll keep on going then.
Great, thank you.
All right, so the next question I think that really comes up is kind of, not to sound too negative about it, but I think to some extent there's a little bit of what does this mean? What does this mean for decision making? What does it mean that we can access these kind of hippocampal memories? And what in particular might it be useful for? And for that, just want to make a little very, very brief literary interlude because a few years ago, my daughter was reading The Giver at school. I don't know, some of you may have read this growing up here. I didn't grow up here, but my daughter pointed out this book that was really relevant, I think, to memory, and I've been recommending it for the past few years to anyone who's interested in memory. And very briefly, it describes this dystopian society in which essentially everything's habitual. There are no choices. Everything's predetermined. In this dystopian world, you're given a family, you're given a job, you're given kind of structure of your day, no agency, no choices, no need really to make decisions. And one of the jobs in the society is somebody who holds memories of the dystopian society from before it became the dystopian society. So memories from when they did have agency and when the world was more complex. And that person holding the memories in his mind is asked to transfer these memories to the young person who's going to replace him. So the person who's been holding the memories of the society in mind is the giver, and he transfers those memories to the receiver. And through describing this odd, dark, dystopian society, and in particular the relationship between the giver and the receiver, the book really, I think, makes a lot of very interesting insights about what memory is for and what does it mean to not have memory, and why would we need it. And one moment in the book, the young boy asks the old man in the middle of this difficult process of transferring the memories, why do we bother keeping these memories? And the giver says, we keep these memories because the elders sometimes need them, and ask me to use them and ask me to report on them, to advise them. And so the young boy asks him, do you advise them often? And the giver says, rarely, only when they are faced with something that they have not experienced before. And I think this is really a beautiful example of this intuition that we need memory when things are uncertain and when things are changing. And at first glance, I think, it might seem paradoxical, especially from these reinforcement learning tests, right? We feel like, oh, memory is what we use when we are in the same situation all over again. I think the insight here, which I think is really synergistic with a lot of the progress in research on memory, is that the purpose of memory is to provide rich, flexible representations that can help us when things are uncertain. We can manipulate our memories and use them to project into the future to make predictions about what will happen. And so one of the lines of work we've been really interested in is exactly this question, which is how does memory guide decisions in new situations? And really, I think part of the interest here is the idea that in the real world, most of what we encounter is somewhere between episodes and averages, where we have multiple experiences that are partly overlapping. Sorry to pick on you, Famika, but it's like, now I saw you 12 years ago, I'm seeing you here. And a lot of our experiences are sort of something repeating, but maybe not in the same way and in regular intervals. And the one thing that memory allows us to do is to really integrate past events to build kind of a generalizable model that extends beyond any one event, and that gives us a model that we can use to generate predictions for a future, especially when there's uncertainty. And so one of the ways we've been thinking about this, I want to share with you kind of one of the first studies we did on this question, or well, not quite the first, but somewhere in earlier days, built on very simple observation having to do with relational encoding. And that is the idea that in any given moment, let's say now, on Stanford campus, you encounter these two features or two stimuli, and what we know from extensive, elegant work on hippocampal processing is that our hippocampus then encodes these two things as related to each other. Sorry, I have no idea how to turn off the beeping on whatever's beeping. Right, so basically we inform this sort of associative link between things that co-occur in time or in space. And the mechanisms of that in of itself are rather interesting, but for our purposes, we thought this actually gives us kind of an interesting hint as to how memories might be used flexibly under conditions of uncertainty, which is that this relational encoding between the S1 and S2, which has been observed in many studies and across many different sort of tools of neuroscience, provides kind of the groundwork for future building on those memories to sort of create a richer network. And in particular, that if you're in a situation where now, let's say you're on the Stanford campus, or I'm on the Stanford campus and I encounter a $100 bill, being on Stanford campus might remind me of Fumiko. And so now, even though she's not here on the Stanford campus that day, I already have this memory connecting Fumiko with the Stanford campus. And now I have a new memory connecting the Stanford campus with some monetary reward. And that essentially what happens in this situation is that we get reactivation of the old memory when there's partial input to retrieve it, so that any kind of partial element of something we've experienced, that when we re-experience it, can pattern complete or reactivate associates related to that. And this creates an opportunity for integrating into memory these elements that actually were never really experienced together. In this case, it could kind of lead to the association of some reward value with Fumiko, even though she wasn't on campus when I found the, whatever it's Stanford, so it should probably be a high bill, a $100 bill. And so we and others refer to this as sort of the role for integration of memory through mechanisms that involve basic kind of encoding and reactivation, and therefore re-encoding of memories when there's partial overlap between events. So we've been interested for many years now in understanding how this happens in the human brain and how it happens. So one, kind of just to give you a flavor, one approach for testing this has been to use tasks that measure this kind of spontaneous integration. In our hands, we felt it's very important to do that without requiring or rewarding it. And we've been inspired by a lot of really interesting paradigms in animal conditioning that have been used more recently also in some of the work on the role of dopamine in decision-making in animals. And that some of these conditioning paradigms really allow us to look carefully at this kind of form of flexibility that can emerge from this sort of mechanism. So I'm gonna, one of the studies we've done, we looked at a task called sensory preconditioning. In sensory preconditioning, you associate two cues in, say, S1 and S2. S2 is then associated with reward, and then one of the S2s is associated with no reward. So the idea is that you create a very simple association here, and then you take one of those inputs from one of the items from the pair associated with reward and one of them not. And what you ask people to do is make decisions between S1s that were never paired with reward, and see if there's a preference between S1s that were associated initially with S2s that were later rewarded versus S1s associated with S2s that were later not rewarded. And so we implemented this in a task that uses various kinds of objects, and I'll show you in a moment, scenes and faces. We control for familiarity and likability and so forth of these images. And we basically do a simple task where we do an association in time. So that might be a pair, and this might be another pair. And the important point just to make here is that there's no reward so far. You're not making any decisions. It's a simple kind of temporal association between these pairs of objects, okay? And then we have a reward phase. We now take the second of these objects, and some of them get paired with reward in a really simple conditioning task. You see the object and you either get money, or you see an object and you don't get money. So we know, and I'll show you in a moment, people are very good at learning which ones of these S2 objects are valuable and which ones are not. And then what we ask people to do is to demonstrate their knowledge by choosing between these S2 stimuli that are either previously rewarded or not. And this is an easy task. And intermixed with that, without any special instructions, we also ask them to make choices between these S1 images that were never, in fact, paired with reward, neither the S1 plus nor the S1 minus. They're just the associates from the first phase, right? So these in the task have never received any kind of monetary value, but the prediction was that people would have a preference for these S1 plus images through this indirect association with the S2s because they became integrated in memory. So that's just an example of what the trials in this phase look like. You're making choices between pairs of items. And we really thought all the action is happening here in the reward phase through this kind of reactivation mechanism that I mentioned earlier. The idea being that when you see this red object, you automatically reactivate this yellow object, even though it's not being shown in the task at all. And that it's this reactivation that would lead to your tendency to choose this image later on. So the analyses I'm going to show you briefly are all from this reward phase here. And we're going to ask to what extent did this reactivation of these S1 associates in the reward phase predict behavior, tendency to choose the S1 plus later in the decision phase. So the fMRI analyses are really going to focus on first, where in the brain does activation during the reward phase predict that this later kind of flexible, generalizable behavior. And second, when, as in which phase does that occur in? And finally, we're going to be looking for evidence for reactivation. So the first result I'm going to show you is basically an analysis just looking at where in the brain does activity during that reward phase, a very, very simple conditioning task. When you're undergoing the simple conditioning, where is there brain activity that predicts your later decision? And what we find is we find significant activity here, bold activity in the hippocampus correlating with that later tendency to prefer the S1+. It's just worth emphasizing, again, this is a simple conditioning task. Many studies have looked at imaging of the conditioning task in terms of the reward learning itself, and that does not, reward learning itself, the direct pairing of a cue with reward does not correlate with bold activity in the hippocampus. It correlates with bold activity in the putamen for the most part and other striatal regions. So hippocampal bold activity predicts the later use of integrated memory. So there could be a lot of different reasons why that might happen. And the critical question we were interested in here is sort of why and how. So we really wanted to find evidence for this reactivation. So we took advantage of the well-known observation that specific areas of visual cortex are active when a person sees or imagines specific kinds of categories of cues. So body parts and faces and outdoor scenes are all known to activate particular regions in visual cortex. And so we exploited this very simple and interesting observation from kind of world of perception and sensation and asked, can we exploit that to make inferences about what people might be reactivating in memory here? And so, in fact, in the real task, the S1 images were not these cool, looking objects. They were instead body parts and faces in outdoor scenes. And what that allowed us to do was take an analysis where we look now for evidence for the specific activation of either body parts, faces, or outdoor scenes during the second phase when those images are not being presented, and ask whether evidence for activity for these category-specific images is correlated with behavior, and specifically with the behavior here in the decision phase. And so what we could do is go into each participant's visual cortex, find the voxels in that person that respond to these particular visual categories when they're presented, and probe activity in those parts of the brain when those images are not presented, but when they're undergoing reward learning. So what I'm plotting here on the x-axis is sort of two different categories of trials. Trials where people showed evidence for behavioral integration and trials where people showed no evidence for behavioral integration. And on the y-axis is average activity in these category-specific regions. And we found there was significantly greater activity in these visual regions for trials where the behavior suggested that there had been integration with those S1 images for reward. So this suggests that there's evidence here for the reactivation of those S1 cues when they were not being presented, but when their associates were being presented, and linking that reactivation to behavior. And so finally, we did a functional connectivity analysis trying to sort of link these pieces together, and we've seen this in another couple studies since then, showing that this activation of the hippocampus during reward learning is functionally correlated with activation in regions of the striatum, here the same regions that are important for the reward learning itself. Oops. Suggesting interaction between those regions. So just as an interim summary of this section suggests that exploring the role of the hippocampus in integrating memories addresses an important challenge in decision making, which has to do with using past experience to inform decisions we haven't directly experienced before. And this is very related for those of you in the decision making world to this idea of sort of model-based decision making, and that we're continuously updating and building to some extent a generative model of the world that allows us to make predictions. The work I didn't have time to show you, which on this is linked specifically to dopamine, so that model-based decisions of this kind are reduced in Parkinson's disease and ameliorated with dopaminergic medication in Parkinson's disease. And in another collaboration with Nathaniel Daw, we've shown that hippocampal contributions to model-based decisions are correlated with hippocampal contributions to spatial cognition, suggesting that there might be really a scaffolding of kind of the spatial representations built by the hippocampus for the purpose of predictions, even about information that isn't intrinsically spatial at all. So I'm going to shift to the last part of the talk, which really has to do with deliberation. This has been an exciting, relatively new direction for the lab, where we really asked sort of how far can we take Can we take this? How far does the role of the hippocampus in decision-making extend? And what about sort of examining decisions that don't at face value really depend on memory at all? I'll be showing you in a moment a task where we're asking people to make very simple decision judgments where there's really no obvious memory trace to rely on, and ask, is the hippocampus contributing in a kind of relational cognition way, in a way that helps solve deliberation? And the kind of decisions we looked at here were ones that might seem really simple, like between Kit Kats and M&Ms. But we designed the task to make these decisions that seem simple actually be quite difficult by asking people to make decisions between things that they like equally. So this decision would be easy for someone who loves Kit Kats and doesn't like M&Ms. But we know that making this decision is notoriously difficult if you're somebody who really likes Kit Kats and M&Ms just to the same degree. And we got interested in this question of why do these so-called difficult decisions take more time, which has been observed across species and a very, very robust phenomenon. And for me, as sort of somebody who's been doing a lot of studies of learning, this is a really fun task to dig into, because this observation that these sorts of decisions take longer is incredibly robust. It's like Stroop. You can't break it no matter what you do. You ask people to make a decision about anything at all, about things that they value similarly, and they slow down, they take more time, suggesting that there's really some kind of extra processing of some sort that plays into these kind of decisions. And we got interested in the idea that maybe some of that extra processing and some of that extra time is related to the fact that people need to resolve the indecision. If value itself isn't enough because you like Kits and M&Ms similarly, then you might need memory mechanisms such as retrieval and prospection and comparison to consider the options and to generate evidence to kind of break the tie between them. So the we in this story is Akram Bakur, again, former postdoc who's starting next month at University of Chicago. And by the way, looking for talented RAs if anybody has anyone. Not easy to recruit during these times. And also collaboration with my colleague here at Columbia, Michael Shadlin, and his former postdoc who's now at Rochester, Ariel Zilberberg. Mike has been spending really a long, fruitful career trying to understand the neural mechanisms that help resolve accumulation of evidence and indecision and perceptual decisions. And so we work together to take that evidence accumulation framework and apply it to decisions about value. And the basic idea guiding our work was that for decisions based on internal evidence, the hippocampus might be what supplies the evidence. And that more difficult decisions require more evidence, and maybe that's why these decisions take more time, is because they're depending on kind of the furnishing of evidence, then that depends on memory. So the first thing we wanted to ask is, do longer decisions engage the hippocampus more? And so we designed a task where we asked people to make a series of decisions between snack items, Kit Kats and M&Ms, pretzels and potato chips, and so forth. Before people engage in the decision task, we got their subjective value for each item individually, so we could kind of construct decisions that were either easy or hard in terms of the difference in value between the items, the hard decisions being the ones where the difference in value is 0, the easy decisions being easier, the greater the difference in value between the items. And to control for decision-making in general and reaction time in general, we also had all the same people do a perceptual task here that where they had to choose, are there more blue dots or are there more yellow dots on the screen? So both decisions involve some deliberation. Both decisions allow us to manipulate the difference between the two items. One depends on an internal source, we think memory, and one depends on an external source, in this case, visual input. And so we could compare reaction time for food choices, controlling for reaction time and decisions in general. So what I'm plotting here on the x-axis is the difference in value between the two items, the one on the right and the one on the left. So 0 here is going to be the indifference point. Okay, so if I like going back Kit Kats and M&Ms equally, the difference in value for me would be 0. And then here's a negative difference in value, and here's a positive difference in value. And I'm going to show you on the top the probability of choosing one of the items as a function of its value, and on the bottom the reaction time. So what you can see here is the probability of choosing, in this case, the item on the right, increases as a function of the difference in value between the item on the right and the item on the left. So you're going to go for the things you said you were going to go, you like, that you value, and you're going to avoid the things that you said you didn't like. You're noisier at that point of indecision. And this is what the reaction time data look like. Again, you slow down and you're noisier at that point of indifference, and you see this kind of classic inverted U-shaped curve for reaction time on these kinds of tasks. Those are the model fits from the evidence accumulation models. I'm going to show you the data for the perceptual decisions. Again, this has been looked at extensively, and this is what is typically observed. Same kind of thing. People are good at detecting if there's more yellow or blue. And the reaction time data show this very kind of canonical inverted U shape, with people being slower in the reaction time at the point of indecision or equivalent color coherence in this case. So it takes more time to decide between options that are closer in value. We want to see if that has anything to do with hippocampal mechanisms. So we did an fMRI analysis that looked at time. We're comparing the reaction time regressors between the tasks and asking, do they differ? And the basic idea is that we have sort of the continuous reaction time for the value-based task, and we have the reaction time for the perceptual task. We want to ask, are there parts of the brain that are more involved in reaction time for the value-based task relative to the perceptual task? But we also want to link this to memory, so we have a separate analysis of memory retrieval in these same participants, sort of as a memory localizer, and we're going to look at where reaction time overlaps or survives a conjunction test with a regressor for memory retrieval. And what we find when we do this analysis is significant activity in the hippocampus. That's showing this, both showing a separate effect of greater reaction time for greater correlation with reaction time for value than perception in voxels that overlap with an individual kind of localizer for memory retrieval. So it suggests that memory-related regions are more active with longer reaction times, especially for value-based decisions. And then last thing I want to show you, and this was really important, is we ourselves were struggling with these data. There were a lot of different reasons why we might find greater activity in the hippocampus, and we thought that really the hardest test, especially for this task that doesn't seem at face value to depend on memory, we kept on thinking, would HM be impaired on this kind of task? To what extent do we think memory is really playing a causal role in this deliberation? And so we partnered with Mika Verfay and Daniela Palombo to test patients with hippocampal damage and kind of typical amnesia, and ask, what do they do when they're confronted with this kind of decision task? Are they able to resolve the indecision, and what does their behavior look like? So I'm just going to show you data from 6 amnesics with medial temporal lobe damage and 14 controls, age-matched and IQ-matched. I'm going to show you the same kind of behavioral data. So first, among controls, you can see that both in the value-based task and in the perceptual task, in this group of controls matched to the patients, we see what we saw before. But what we see for the amnesics is interesting, but on the perceptual task, we see no significant differences. So they're able to perform this perceptual task just as well as the healthy controls. Again, this sort of probability choice on the top and reaction time on the bottom. They're a little bit faster, actually, in terms of reaction time, especially in the middle of the curve, but this is not a significant difference. And of course, these patients are very hard to find. This is only 6 patients. But when we looked at the behavior for the value-based decision test, we find first that they're pretty accurate. So this doesn't look like kind of any blatant forgetting. They're able to be consistent in their choices with what they said they would value, although they're a little noisier. But what was really striking to us was this difference in reaction time, that they're much slower, and their graph is not, their reaction time pattern is not just slower, but also significantly flatter relative to the controls. And this is not a simple speed accuracy trade-off. We can sort of do all kinds of calculations that show that the slowing is much above and beyond what the slight changes in accuracy would predict. So it suggests that hippocampal damage selectively impairs value-based decisions, not perceptual decisions. And these are the individual data, which of course with 6 people is very important to show, and these are available also in the paper, basically showing that really for the amnesics here, all of them show this sort of slowing and flattening, and all of them perform pretty well on the perceptual decisions, and there's no correlation between the two. So it's not the ones who are slower on perception who are slower on value. So this data suggests a role for memory in deliberation and decision-making, and in particular for helping resolve decisions between options with the same value, a kind of phenomenon that's been explored a lot in economics and philosophy, often referred to as Burd's paradox, these difficult decisions between things that are equal. I know for at least some of you whose names I saw is preaching to the choir, but I think really kind of, an opportunity to emphasize that studying patients with lesions offers an important test of theories. And in this case, also new insights into basic mechanisms of behavior. We expected that the difference would be in reaction time, but the kind of nuances of that effect raise a lot of new questions for us to continue exploring. So just to summarize all these different pieces, across 3 very different kinds of behavior, we've shown that all of these behaviors I've shown you today involve very simple decisions about value. All of them, nonetheless, involve the hippocampus, and for all 3, the hippocampus is not just linked to deciding or not deciding, but it's really linked to specific and relatively subtle aspects of behavior of the kind that really depend on this kind of relational cognition. And in all of them, we're finding that the role of the hippocampus interacts in what looks like sort of a form of integration or cooperation with regions of the striatum. So there's no separation really between those functions. And in many ways, I think this sort of also raises questions about kind of motivation and memory and the link between them. Big question moving forward are kind of really what are the circuit mechanisms for bringing information from one representation into the integration with other forms of evidence. So to conclude, suggest there's a broad role for the hippocampal memory system in guiding decisions that depend on internal evidence, that the hippocampus and the striatum work together to guide memory-based decisions, and that much of this happens outside of awareness. I didn't go into this in detail, but I think it's actually rather important. I'm happy to take questions about that or talk about that, and we've written about this. And some of the implications I think really have to do, nowadays I think about this a lot, have to do with policy and economics. What happens now when our politicians and policymakers are making decisions under this extreme uncertainty? To what extent is memory, I think, really an important driver in kind of that prospection and deliberation that feeds into decisions under uncertainty? Of course, we think it has really important implications for mental health, and one of the areas that we've actually spent quite a bit of efforts on, actively working on, has to do with decisions in eating disorders. So I want to thank you for your time. Wanted to thank the folks in the lab. This is the updated image. Thank you for bearing with me in a Zoom talk, which is always a little different. I'm happy to take any questions at all.
I'm going to try to unmute everyone, and then so we have an opportunity to clap. So thank you very much. Oops, I haven't unmuted everyone, I apologize.
All good, no worries.
Is everyone unmuted? I am seeing people muted, but I'm gonna try one more time. It says everyone's unmuted, but I don't think everyone is, but I'm gonna clap on everyone's behalf. Thank you so much. So does anyone have questions? Or please feel, you don't have to type in the chat box, but you can just jump in and ask your questions. Okay, so there's a question here from a person called Vadim Axelrod. Thank you very much. With regard to the last study, have you collected any introspective reports? Is everything happen in an implicit way, or subjects sometime explicitly recall what snack liked last time?
Yeah, it's a great question. We collected a lot of kind of self-reports about what people feel they're doing, and both in controls and in amnesics. And you know, this is a case where people really don't tend to report. The only person I think who gave us kind of our hypothesis back was my dad. At some point, I asked him when I was sort of piloting things, or just chatting about why are some decisions difficult, and he said, yeah, because you kind of have to like use your memory to predict what's going to happen in the future, and both memories are competing or something like that. But yes, our assumption and here, based on evidence, is that people are not explicitly turning to memory. And in fact, the amnesics really like this task. They feel that this is a task that's easy for them. We're not asking them, what did you have for breakfast memory? And then they're facing this kind of difficulty. It feels smooth and continuous for them.
Great, thank you. Ted Rosenkrantz's question is, preterm infants have abnormal connections of fMRI compared to term infants? Have these type of studies been done on the preterm population as they get in their teens and 20s?
That's interesting. I don't know of any studies that have really looked at that. We started looking at healthy adolescents. You know, there's a lot of interest in adolescents with attention deficits. Haven't looked at that in particular. I think that potentially interesting. I can imagine combining that with kind of some kind of resting state connectivity, or we do have, so that maybe that's a good link. My former grad student Raphael Garrity and Julia Davido followed up in some of this work, and we had a paper where we looked at just resting state connectivity between VMPFC, striatum, and hippocampus, and whether it relates to this kind of sensory preconditioning S1 plus preference, and found that it does. So that circuit and how well connected it is seems to explain some of the variability, some of the extensive variability we see in the healthy population.
I see. So he has wanted to talk. He's included his email, but Ted, I might suggest you reach out to Daphna as well. We will send this chat box text message to her, but in case she gets a lot of email requests. So please reach out to her as well. A question from Samantha Walters. Can you discuss the outside of awareness, in quotes, component of hippocampus and striatum guiding memory-based decisions?
Yeah, it could be a whole talk, and I at some point gave a talk really just on that component. And there's so much to say about it. I think it's so fascinating for many reasons. So one, right, historically, we all learned that the distinguishing factor between sort of hippocampal memories and non-hippocampal memories was sort of access to conscious awareness. And I think what's become increasingly clear over the last 10 to 15 years has been sort of a wealth of data, mostly thanks to fMRI, showing giving many examples of hippocampal contributions to behaviors that at least seem at first glance to have nothing to do with sort of conscious explicit memories. In fact, my colleague Nick Turk-Brown and I did a special issue on this topic 7 or 8 years ago. And there are two additional things to say about that. So I think one is there's convincing evidence that the hippocampus contributes to all kinds of memory-related cognitive processes in ways that people are not aware of, animals are not aware of. Second, that doesn't at all help us understand the very fascinating aspect of a subjective recollection of a memory. I'm remembering Stanford campus 12 years ago. I can talk about it, I feel aware of that. That is not equivalent to hippocampal activity, and that leaves, I think, a bit of a mystery for us as a field to try to explain what that part of it is. And then the third has to do maybe with sort of the quotation marks, which is that this is a very difficult problem to answer, and it's very difficult to prove that something is not consciously aware. But what we can do, and what we have been doing, many of us, is sort of testing awareness in many different ways and asking, is there evidence that something seems to be happening in a way that doesn't move along with awareness? So that's more or less been our approach, but it's not an easy, we can tell if people are choosing blue or choosing yellow, if people are choosing Kit Kats or M&Ms, what exactly they're aware of, and this is sort of a problem, the study of consciousness in general, it comes down to subjective reports of what people say they're aware of.
Great, thank you. I have 2 more questions so far. One is from Mary Pat McAndrews, linking this to hippocampal function in prospection and autobiographical memory, wondering about variability in the HC striatum interaction. Is there something like severely deficient and extraordinary poles in the healthy population?
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's certainly a lot of variability there. I can apply that to anything, right? So I think, these kind of learning tasks, we see a lot of variability. There's a lot of variability. The phenomenon of slowing down with these difficult decisions is very robust. How much of that happens? There's a lot of variability in the healthy controls. We haven't really done much to try to sort of look at that as an individual difference measure on the extremes, except for that study I just mentioned with the resting state connectivity. That was from 2015, I think. So yeah, yeah, I don't know if I have a really good answer to that other than to say, we make inferences about, we tend to think of patient populations on some very, very extreme end of things. And so I'd expect to see variability in connectivity related to variability in these behaviors. We don't have a lot of data on it so far.
Great, thank you. Chris Hefner, at the beginning of the talk and just now in your response to Samantha Walters, you said you hoped your projects would speak to the idea of separate memory systems, and you showed interesting evidence that the declarative and procedural systems interact with each other. How do you distinguish between two interacting systems in a single integrated system?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think there are two answers to that. One, that's, I think, at least to me, a little bit less interesting, which is sort of the semantics, like, should we be calling it an integrated system? Should we be calling them separate systems? I think it's an important question, but it's a difficult one. It's not one that my tools as a neuroscientist are well suited for. And I think the second really has to do with the nature of those connections and interactions. And that's the one I think is more interesting. And I think, as you're implying, it kind of, it might make the semantic distinction less important. It really, might render it moot, because what we really want to get at, what we've been trying to get at, is the idea that there's a network of regions contributing to these behaviors, and we can identify nodes in the network, but also the connectivity between them, and we can ask questions, like in collaboration with Danny Bassett, about to what extent do those connections get stronger or weaker as a function of experience, as a function of learning, as a function of decisions. So I feel, I'm using the terminology in many ways that I inherited from our field, which is talked about dissociable, separate, multiple memory systems. And from that perspective, I think it's important to say that the work out there in the last 10 to 15 years has suggested that's not right. That's just not, those are not separate. They're not dissociable. It's a lot messier than that. I don't think we've reached yet the point of knowing exactly what to replace that with in terms of terminology or characterization, except that we're, from the neuroscience, neuroanatomy perspective, yes, these are kind of nodes and networks, and that's, I think, really the best way to think about characterizing their dynamics.
Great. One final question. Let's see. Chris says thank you, and then thank you very much for the talk. This is from Najla Azizes, I believe. I have a question related to the memory integration test with the blue, red, and object cards. In your opinion, what would happen if you use contradictory values to the cards? How the subjects would make their decisions then if their memories are contradictory, and what will happen to the hippocampus putamen connections in this case?
Yeah, it's a great question also, because so we've had a couple of studies like that where we set the task up. So here the point was you could do whatever. We gave people the freedom to kind of ignore the objects or not, but they were never pit. We never pit them against each other. We have a couple of other studies where we've done that. One, Wimmer is the first author, and one, Duncan is the first author, where we really set things up that it was an either or. And then we see basically that when you design a task where there's competition between the memories, that's what you see in the imaging data and in the behavior as well, which looks more like a kind of strategic choice, like what am I going to rely on when? We also have a new direction kind of exploring that by Jonathan Nicholas, a graduate student in the lab currently, who's really looking at the role of uncertainty in modulating that. Do people shift towards or away one kind of memory representation more when there's more uncertainty in the environment or less uncertainty in the environment? So I think it's an important question, because it really sort of broadens the scope of saying, we're not just saying they always work together. We're saying that when they do, we can track it in behavior and in brain and get into it. And when we design or have a real world situation, one would hope, where they're pit against each other, that there's sort of more of a choice and separation between them.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's time. Our time is up. So thank you very much, Daphna, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Bye. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.